So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And I'm thrilled to be with you today for this meeting of the virtual reading group. We are, as we all know, in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's posthumously published collection, Responsibility and Judgment, edited by Jerome Cohn. And we're in the middle of this long lecture course that she gave twice, once in New York and once in Chicago, called Some Questions of Moral Philosophy. Last week, we read the first part of this course, in which she raises the question of evil, and also the question of the loss of morality in our time. This worry that for generations, maybe centuries, maybe millennia, we've largely been able to rely on sort of a common sense idea that we all knew what morality was. Turn the other cheek. It's better to suffer wrongs than do wrongs. Do unto others as you've had them do to yourself, and that these were fairly certain moral propositions and precepts. And yet, beginning in the early parts of the 20th century, Arendt says this morality collapsed and came to be seen as simply a set of mores, a set of customs. Morality comes from the word more, a set of customs, of habits, and that we could trade them and change them in for other ones. And she was concerned with this loss of this tradition of morality, and the idea that morality was no longer potentially a matter of course. We can no longer assume, she says, that every sane man knows what is right. She pursued this through the Eichmann trial, and through a reading of Kant as well, and comes to this question at the end about to what extent can we say that there are wicked people or evil people, and how do we respond to evil? And she says, there are things that are just evil, and we have to wish and say that they should never have happened. It's sort of an introduction. It's sort of setting the ground. In part two, which we're reading today, we really begin her deep dive into an attempt to think in an Arendtian way, to think about what is morality, some questions of morality. And it begins by her saying, once again, that we had said that these words, morality from more and ethics from ethos, we thought and we think that they mean more than their etymology, right? We think that they don't mean just a set of customs or just a set of habits, ethos, that which we're at home in. We seem to think that there's an absolute distinction between right and wrong, right? Morality means you should do this and you shouldn't do that. And that, secondly, we think everyone can make this distinction. And so, is that true? Is there something more to morality than just a set of customs? And is it something that we all can do? So on page 77, she says that moral prepositions are held to be self-evident, right? They can't be proven. Again, the idea being that there is such a thing as a moral proposition. It's better to suffer wrong than do wrong. And we can't prove it. You can't sort of the moral philosophy to the contrary. You can't philosophically ground or prove moral propositions. In some sense, they're just things we have to know or see. And she says that there's a hint maybe of how we can think about this in the fact that so many of our moral propositions mention and concern the self, right? So love thy neighbor as thyself. Don't do unto others what you wouldn't have done to yourself. And she says maybe there's something about morality that concerns the self, which of course is somewhat counterintuitive, because one of the things we often say about morality is that it's selfless, right? That to be a moral person is to be selfless, to put others before yourself. And she's now going to maybe turn that around and say, no, to some important sense, morality means a profound involvement with oneself. And another hint of this comes from our word conscience, a seeing with, a consciousness, a kind of knowing of oneself. And so she's going to turn this proposition around. She begins this inquiry as Arendt often does, or begins, but I think re-begins this inquiry as she often does, with an example, right? It's funny. I mean, I don't know if I had ever thought of this before, but when I was reading the example this time, which begins on page 78, I had a strong inkling that Arendt is somewhat talking about herself, but I could be wrong. In any case, she says those few people who, during the moral collapse of Nazi Germany, remained completely intact and free of all guilt, never went through anything like a great moral conflict or great crisis of conscience. I mean, how can she know this about other people? But I think what she's saying, and I think she's talking about people like Karl Jaspers and some others, there were people who simply knew the Nazis were wrong and knew they were evil. Now, a lot of people knew they were wrong and knew they were evil, and yet were like, well, they're in power, they're democratically elected, what do I do? And she's like, there are some people who just never had a doubt. They never debated the pros and cons. They didn't have to ponder the issues. They're not idiots. They knew there was danger in going against the Nazis. They were afraid. But as she says on 78, they never doubted that crimes remained crimes, even if legalized by the government. And so this statement that they never doubted that crimes remain crimes, even if legalized by the government, which she then glosses as saying, for people who never doubted this, they simply couldn't follow the laws of the Nazi period. There were things they couldn't do. They couldn't fire Jewish professors, right? As her friend and teacher Martin Heidegger did. They couldn't allow books to be banned and burned. There were things she thought just that couldn't be done. And so she says at the bottom of 78 on to 79, and this I think is one of the more central takeaways or lines of importance in this text. She says, morally, the only reliable people when the chips are down are those who say, I can't. Right? It's an important point because, Arendt, like many of her friends, was an intellectual. And what she notices is how many really brilliant intellectuals coordinated with the Nazis, made a decision to work with them, reasoned themselves through the idea of the, of that the lesser evil argument that we talked about 2 weeks ago when we read Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, rationalized their compliance. And intellectuals, as she often says, are so good at that. They're good at rationalizing. They're good at making excuses. But there are some people who just, when they were confronted with these laws, said, I can't do it. And she says, morally, the only reliable people when the chips are down are those who say, I can't. And this is part of, this example, right, from the people who resist the Nazis, who say, I can't, is now going to propel the rest of this lecture course, in not only in part 2 here, but in the following parts as well. Because what it's going to force us to confront, right, is that morality is not rational. Morality is not something that comes through argument or persuasion. Morality is not something that we can go to a philosophy class and learn the foundations of morality. She doesn't think that's the case at all. What she's going to say is that morality is something concerned with ourself, that is something that those who have it simply can't do certain things. And so one thing that results from this insight about morality that Arendt is offering is that morality is powerless. It's only negative. Morality can tell you, don't kill when you're told to kill, or don't humiliate this prisoner when you're told to humiliate the prisoner. That's what morality can do. It can stop you. So some of you may remember, if you've read the Symposium, right, Plato's Symposium, where Socrates is on the way to the symposium, and his daemon, this daemon, sometimes called his conscience or something like that, appears to him, and he stops in the street and he stands there for like 6 hours until he thinks it through. And Arendt claims that morality is like a daemon like this. It can stop you from doing something you should not do, but it can never tell you what you should do. So morality doesn't ever tell you what to do. It and that's why it's impotent. It's powerless. It only can stop you from doing what you know you cannot do. And so here, in thinking about morality as that which simply stops us because we can't do something, she's like, how do we think that through? And she then distinguishes Socrates from Plato, right? And Socrates is someone who says, I can't tell you what morality is. I don't know. They say I'm wise, but the only thing that I'm wise about is I don't know what I'm wise about. I can't know the truth. Whereas Plato, she says, parts company with Socrates precisely on this point. Socrates talks. Socrates says, I'm right, even if no one else agrees with me. Socrates says we can change our mind on moral matters, but we must constantly reason it out. We must talk about it. He believed in the spoken word, that argument. He believes that it's an argument which we don't arrive at with any conclusions, but by constantly talking about it in a sequence of spoken statements that we come to know what we believe. But it's what we believe. There are no fixed truths for Socrates. Against this, Plato says that laws are those unchanging laws, right? That since most of us can't know them because we disagree, the philosophers can know them. And the philosophers, through the cave analogy and the doctrine of ideas, can come to know this truth about what is right or wrong, and then we can impose it upon other people through myths or through punishments or myths about punishment. The point is that for Plato, only the few can see the good, and we use myths to control the rest. Arendt is struck by the fact that today we have little to fall back on when we talk about morality, except these myths. And yet we no longer believe these myths, right? We live, she says, ours is the first, this is on page 89. Ours is the first generation since the rise of Christianity in the West, in which the masses, and not only a small elite, no longer believe in future states, right? Bang. That's the problem. Our entire history of morality from Plato on, right, she says, has proceeded on a fundamental belief that we can make the masses believe in myths. We can make the masses believe that if they are immoral, they'll go to hell, and they don't want to do that. We can make them believe that they'll be punished eternally. And suddenly, you know, the few in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries begin to see, oh, Christianity is a myth or punishment's a myth. But it's really in the 20th century that the masses no longer believe. And in that no longer believing, the self-evidence of the moral propositions, which we sort of had to believe because we didn't want to go to hell, crumbles. We no longer believe in the punishments, and thus we no longer believe that the moral propositions are self-evident. And that's the dangerous situation we find ourselves in. And so she says, there's an alternative, though, to the Platonic idea that the way we make the moral propositions self-evident is through myths and threats. And that alternative is to go back, in a sense, to Socrates, to go back to this idea that morality doesn't come by the few imposing moral truths on the many, but in all of us having the capacity to speak with ourselves, to think with ourselves in what she calls a 2-in-1. I who am one can speak with myself, can talk to myself, and I can ask myself, should I treat these prisoners inhumanely? Should I take these people crossing the border and put them in a cage? Should I beat these people in the street? Should I put someone in a chokehold and hold them for 30 seconds or 2 minutes or 8 minutes? Right? I have to ask myself with that. And there's no transcendent standard. There's no Platonic philosopher or wise man who's going to tell me this is the rule, and if you break the rule, you're going to jail or you're going to hell. But there's me and myself. And so when we lose morality as a set of propositions imposed from above, Arendt says, we have to resurrect morality as something that emerges from my own conversation with myself, my own thinking. Morality, she says, is actually pre-philosophical, right? And that means that I have to talk to myself and I have to remember what I've done. And it's in that act of remembering that I can repent and I can reform. And if you don't remember, you can't repent and you can't change your behavior. Which is why she says on 94 to 95, she then returns to this, what she calls the bothersome question of the nature of evil. And what she says is, yeah, I mean, there are people who out of despair choose evil. But the greatest evildoers, right, are not those. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter. They're the people who don't think for themselves, who don't converse with themselves. And because they don't converse with themselves, when they are told to put people in prison or put them in a gas chamber, they don't have that daemon, that Socratic daemon. They don't have that other voice, that other self saying, you know, are you sure you want to do that? You can't do that. That's just, how can you live with yourself if you do that? And with these people, and that, so she says, evil comes because they're people who don't think with themselves. That's what she calls shallowness. That's what she calls banality. It's not thinking with oneself. It's someone who simply goes along without giving themselves the time to stop and think. And so morality, she says, may actually come not from propositions, not from wisdom, not from philosophy, but simply from the activity of thinking. Because in the activity of thinking, you have to ask yourself, can I live with that? Can I live with myself if I do these things? And what she's trying to suggest is that what she means by banality, what she's really arguing in the Eichmann book, and here thinking it through in a lecture, is that what allowed Eichmann to do evil was his thoughtlessness, was this shallowness, this inability to actually question himself. And this idea of thoughtfulness as the foundation of morality, not of any specific morality, because it can never tell you what to do. It can only tell you what you can't do, is where she's going to be going in the next two sections of this essay or of this lecture course. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and remind us that there's different ways you can participate in the conversation of the reading group. One, through the chat, which I believe is open and active. Is it going? Yeah. And please be respectful of the way you speak to each other in the chat. I won't be moderating the chat. I just have to focus on you guys. And then the other is to go down to the reactions button, hit your raise your hand and join the conversation. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Dina, you're up first.
If Jerome wants to go first, that's okay by me.
Jerry, you want to go first, or you want to let Dina go first? I don't. Jerry, you're muted, so I don't know if you're there. Let me see. Dina, why don't you go and we'll get to Jerry next.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead, Dina,
Okay.
and then we'll do Jerry next.
All right. I have a question about page 91 in my edition, which is related to the distinction between diagnostai and dialogestai, and specifically where Arendt says that it goes to the relationship of the two in one, and Arendt describes how diagnostai and dialogestai are related. My question isn't philological or about ancient Greece, or whether she's interpreting this correctly. I'm wondering why, on what basis, Arendt claims in the footnote that's related to this section that there is a priority, that dialogestai has a priority over diagnostai, which is the thinking of oneself, to oneself, versus the speaking of it. I find that interesting. I understand why she'd want to say that. It may go to the idea of the public and of displaying, but I don't know what the basis for it is. And I related to that, she ends that section with a thought saying that thoughtfulness by itself, right, doesn't result in the poem or the work of art or the painting. So I think that's related here. But if that is the case, why then does she say there's a priority to speaking over thinking?
Okay, so thanks. Thank you, Dina. So just so everyone can follow what Dina is asking about. So Dionystatai is a thinking through from nous or mind. And dialegestai is a speaking through from logos or legein, to say or to speak a matter. And so many of you probably know that Plato writes dialogues, right? They're not treatises, they're dialogues, which are dialegestatai. They're a speaking through of questions rather than of a thinking through of questions. Part of Arendt's argument that's in the background here is that the early Platonic dialogues are more dialogues, and the later ones are more treatises in dialogue form. And so part of that is all of what's going on in these conversations. So when she says on page 91 in the paragraph, in the section that Dina is asking about, that in the Theaetetus, Socrates gives a clear account of what she means by the relationship between the I and myself. She says, quote, Plato wishes to explain what or Socrates wishes to explain what he understands by Dionystatai, to think a matter through. And he says, I call it discourse that the mind carries on with itself about any subject it is considering. And I'll explain it to you, though I'm not too sure about it myself. It looks to me as though this is nothing else than dialegestai, a talking something through, only that the mind asks itself questions and answers them, saying yes or no to itself. Then it arrives at the limit where things must be decided, when the two say the same and are no longer uncertain. And at the end of this, she says, and you find the same description in almost identical words in the Sophist, another Platonic dialogue. Thought and spoken statement are the same, except that the thought is a dialogue carried on by the mind with itself without sound. An opinion is the end of this dialogue. That a wrongdoer will not be a very good partner for the silent dialogue seems rather obvious. And then in the footnote 12, which is on page 279, she ends it by saying, no one who knows how to think will ever again be able simply to obey and to conform, not because of a rebellious spirit, but because of the habit of examining everything. In the Apology, Socrates' last answer to the judges was, I can't give up examining. Why couldn't he do it in silence? The priority of dialegestai over Dionystatai. So the point she's making, right, is that for Socrates, thinking is speaking. Why is there a priority of speaking over thinking, of speaking through rather than thinking through? Because to think is to constantly ask oneself questions, right? To examine others and oneself, to say, yes and no, ask questions, and I have to answer them. And so it's through that dialogue that I, at the end of it, coming up with an opinion, that's a thought, a doxa. But you don't start with the rule and then go through the process. You start with the process and it comes up with the rule, or not the rule, the opinion. And so there's a priority in the sense of it's prior, that speaking with oneself is what thinking is, which leads one to have an opinion. It's not that one starts with a rule and then thinks the rule. And that this is the Socratic idea of how one thinks, very different from the Platonic idea, right? The Platonic idea of how one thinks is one learns geometry, and in learning geometry, one learns to abstract oneself from the world and to train oneself to look at ideas, concepts that are outside. And one sees these ideas, these truths, and the few who can do that then come back in and compel the rest to follow them. The point is that moral philosophy, as it's been practiced for 2,000 years since Plato, has largely been a Platonic exercise. And Arendt is asking us to try and understand a different Socratic approach to such moral thinking. Dina, does that answer your question? I think
it comes very close. I just think Arendt might take it one step further, which is she's trying to explain what brought Socrates to the marketplace, so that the opinion he's arriving at could be one that he keeps in silence, and yet he goes out and speaks it. And I think that's the step how I would interpret the priority of speaking over thinking.
Well, that assumes that Socrates is lying to us, right? That he actually is wise, but doesn't tell us he's wise. He knows his opinion, but doesn't want to tell us. I certainly not my reading of Socrates, and I don't think it's my reading of Arendt. So I don't know why you would, just to explain to me why you would want to.
Because that footnote asks something beyond, asks, what is it that brings us to display what is otherwise silent?
What brings us to display what is otherwise silent?
Yes. So there is the option, right? Or at least in theory, that to think is to ask oneself questions in silence. My question is, what then? On what basis then do we reveal that?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question. That she's going to get to that into the third and fourth lectures. That's actually going to become a big part of it, right? Part of the, if you accept this claim that thinking is speaking with oneself and thus is a withdraw from the world and is silent, thinking is impotent, right? As I already said, because it can't tell you what to do, but it's also invisible, right? No one can see it.
Right.
And so you could then say thinking has no impact on the world. And she says that's, and she'll say, and I think it's in section 3, which we're going to read for next week, she's going to say, yes, that's right. But she's going to say there's one great exception to that, right? Which is when the thinker, because they stop and think, says, I can't do what everyone else is doing. Everyone else is, allowing people to be put in jail or allowing immigrants to be rounded up or whatever it is. And the thinker says, no, I can't. And he or she goes home. And in doing that, they make their thought palpable, visible in the world in their act of negation. And that's when thinking can become powerful in the world as a political act. But otherwise it can't. Now, I think the other way thinking can be palpable in the world to some degree is when someone like Socrates takes the act of thinking and brings it into the marketplace in his act of questioning, but not because he knows the truth, but because he knows that other people don't know the truth, and he wants to make more people think. And that means more people be willing to question themselves and their truisms. And so, that's how I think she sees this matter.
Okay, well, that answers my question then. Thank you, because
Okay.
I think she ends that footnote by asking just that question.
Great. And
why
you'll
can't
see
he do it in silence? Well, he's going out to the marketplace too.
Right. And I think that he does that when he thinks that there are too many people who don't think and need to be, in a sense, reminded of the need to think. Jerry, good to see you.
Good to see you, Roger. I have two simple questions for you. One is taken from the first part of your lecture. One is taken from the last part of your lecture, but I think they're not unconnected, and it'll be very easy. They're very straightforward. They will not be complicated. They will not stress you. These questions are easy. The first one has to do with what you said in the beginning, that you cannot prove, according to this lecture, cannot prove moral propositions. You cannot tell you what you must do. I would say that probably the most important thinker for Hannah Arendt was Immanuel Kant, and I would suggest that's exactly what he attempted to do. He attempted to prove moral propositions. She says, by the way, elsewhere, that Kant is the last moral philosopher. He attempted to prove moral propositions and to tell you exactly what you must do. That's my first question, just to respond to that. The second one is from the end, where you said Eichmann was guilty of not thinking, but he wasn't punished for not thinking. I would submit, Roger, for your consideration, he was submitted for committing a crime against humanity, the only one Arendt recognizes. So it is not what you said to me, said that Eichmann was guilty of not thinking, but he wasn't punished for not thinking. That's all.
Jerry, you lied incredibly in your opening there, because these are not simple questions. I think these are two very profound questions, and they're probably both things that, you and I have slight differences of opinion on, but that's helpful. So let me just respond and you can come back at me. You're right that Kant is deeply important for Arendt. And he is probably the last, well, I don't know. He's certainly one of he's the last moral philosopher who believed that we could salvage law as a philosophically grounded moral obligation. But now let me say there's a huge divergence in Kant's scholarship on what I'm about to say, right? Kant wrote a couple of books on law, right? The two sort of that I'm going to put against each other are something called The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Die Grundlegung zur Metaphysik des Sitten, which is the critical philosophy part, which takes the second critique and makes it into a shorter, in a sense, popular book. And the other is The Foundations of Morality. In The Foundations of Morality, Kant does what Jerry says he does, right? Which is, in a sense, try and prove moral foundations to certain laws. In The Groundwork, he doesn't. In The Groundwork, Kant says the only thing that I can prove philosophically is that I am autonomous as a rational being. And as a rational being, I must set myself under the universal law. But he specifically says many times, you can't tell me no one can tell me what the universal law is. Only I can set myself under the universal law. So there's a huge debate in Kant scholarship of whether the groundwork, which says you can't know what the content of the law is, all you can know is that you must obey the law, can be in some sense reconciled with the foundations of law, which says, no, here are the laws and here are their foundations. Arendt, in a number of places, makes it clear that she doesn't think these two books can be reconciled, and says that Kant was going senile when he wrote Foundations of Law, and that the only one to take seriously is the groundwork. It's the same. That's actually an argument that is also made by her former teacher, Martin Heidegger. And it's largely an argument I've embraced in my reading of Kant and Arendt. You can argue both sides, and I'm not saying it's 100% right, but I think it is Arendt's argument. So she does, the Kantian groundwork does suggest that there is a philosophical foundation for the obligation to obey the universal law that I put myself under as a rational being. That law comes from the fundamental belief that I am rational. I'm not sure, here's a really controversial claim for you, Jerry, and I'm not sure Arendt accepts that anymore. I actually, I sort of go from the assumption that Arendt's thinking about morality and law presumes that we can no longer take it as self-evident that we are all rational beings and thus all must submit ourselves, our sensible selves, to a rational law, which was the Kantian proposition. She may think that's true. I don't know. She never says it's not, but I don't think she thinks we can accept it as something that we expect everyone to do. Kant thought, if I can rationally convince everybody that they're rational beings and they have to do this, they should do it. I don't think Arendt thought that anymore. That's part of the crumbling of tradition, the crumbling of the pillars. I just don't think she thought that reason had its persuasive power anymore that Kant assumed that it did. And so I do think in the end that for her, we do need to think about morality without banisters, including the banisters of reason. And for her, that's, again, go back to Dinas Question, that's the priority of speaking over nous, reason, a mind. We have to go back to building morality up from the conversations level, not from a rational level down. And that's how I understand her on that topic. This relates to your second question, right, about Eichmann. Eichmann was punished by the Israeli court. But as you know very well, at the end of the book, she offers her own judgment. And she also, says many times what he did was beyond, she says, look, the court was right. The only law he broke was the law against aiding and abetting murder. And she says, but that would be idiotic and morally obtuse to convict Eichmann of aiding and abetting murder. What he did was so much bigger and worse than that. And so what she says, again, this is my reading, and I've written many articles about it. Not everyone agrees with me. But I think what she says is the reason Eichmann must be killed is not because he's being punished for a crime. I think she's saying he has to be killed because he participated, and in participating supported a system of bureaucratic mass murder. And we cannot reconcile ourselves to that idea in the world, which he now supported and stands for. And so he has to be killed not because he's being punished for a crime, but because sometimes evil people have to simply have a millstone put around their neck and thrown into the ocean. And that's the only reason that he must die, as she says at the end. And so I take that to be a judgment on her part. That's a political judgment, not a legal judgment. Not a legal judgment that he broke a law and has to be punished, but a political judgment that certain actions are not reconcilable, and people who do them simply sometimes have to be expunged from the earth. And that's my reading of the end of Eichmann. So anyway, Jerry, I don't know if any of that it makes sense to you, or it may or not, and you can tell me it doesn't, but that's how I read both those points.
Thank you, Roger. I would say only just one brief comment and then I'll shut up. I believe that, according to Arendt, and this goes against, in part, I don't think the spirit of what you're saying, but in the letter maybe, that Eichmann was guilty of a crime, and that was the crime against humanity, the crime against the political plurality, human plurality. That, I believe, is her justification for his being put to death.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Although there was, as you know, there was no writ, there was no.
No, that's her. It's not the court. I'm not talking about.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, she did think he was guilty against a crime against plurality, and for that he must hang. But again, that I don't think I don't think she wants to say that is sort of a crime that we should write down, and anyone who does it, should hang. I mean, I think she wants to say sometimes you need to make a judgment that's beyond just black letter law, and announce that people like him just have to be, as she says in other places, a millstone put around their neck and thrown into the ocean.
Indeed, the scandal.
The scandal, exactly. And I think that's how she judges Eichmann, which doesn't mean that she doesn't also, as you rightly say that he did violate a crime against humanity, which at that point was not a recognized crime. It's one that came into being because of what he and his colleagues did.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Roger.
Thank you, Jerry, always. Harold.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So there's a book called Nuremberg Diary. Dr. Gilbert was the prison psychologist for the Nuremberg trial, and he kept a diary. One thing that's really interesting is that because, I mean, he was representing the U.S. In that, but because he spoke German, he was able to have conversations with the prisoners that other people who were examining them weren't necessarily able. I just wanted to read one thing because I think it supports in a certain way all of this. I'm talking about Colonel Husse, who was the commandant at Auschwitz. And so it was an afternoon interview, and he said, I asked him if he had ever considered whether the Jews whom he had murdered were guilty or had in any way deserved such a fate. Again, he tried patiently to explain that there was something unrealistic about such questions because he had been living in an entirely different world. And this is a quote, don't you see, we SS men were not supposed to think about these things. It never even occurred to us. And besides, it was something already taken for granted that the Jews were to blame for everything. Just wanted to put that out there that when and the book is full of everything that Arendt is saying about thinking, not thinking, and morality. It just goes on and on. But people may want to read this at some point if they have an interest in that.
No, thank you, Harold. And I think you've actually recommended that book to me before, and I've really enjoyed, and I enjoyed it is a hard word, but I've profited from it. So thank you. Yeah, I think that is exactly what she's saying here on the end of this section on 96, 95, 96, 97. And she says a similar thing in I think the postscript to the Eichmann book, or maybe it's somewhere else, I forget, where she says that before the Eichmann trial, he was interrogated by a Israeli captain, I think. Someone maybe remembers the name. I think it's Abner Less, but I could have it wrong. Someone want to remind me? Anyway, and this Israeli captain who's interrogating him and taking his his depositions, not interrogation, deposing him. Eichmann keeps telling him, I didn't have you would have done the same thing if you were in my position, right? I was just doing what I had to do, and you would have done it, And Arendt says, holy cow! I mean, here he is talking to a Jewish German survivor in Israel, and trying to convince him that he would have also, done all this. How could he be so shallow, so dumb, so thoughtless as to not see that there's another perspective, that there's another way to think about it? And she says that's what I mean by thoughtlessness. And I think what Rudolf Huss is saying there, if I have it right, is very much the same thing. And that's why the greatest evil, she says here, is done by people who simply don't think, who never and thus can't remember another way of being. Nothing can hold them back. So yeah, thank you, Harold. George.
This brings me again, not to Kant, but to Kahneman. I mean, what we were just talking about is confirmation bias. That is, you only want to deal with people who think like you think. And that happens when you're, and this is when it comes to Arendt, thinking to yourself still involves confirmation bias, because you're just talking to yourself.
Well, I'll add one thing there, George, and I think you're absolutely right. But for her, thinking with oneself means letting your mind go wandering and trying to think from the perspective of others, right? That's the second part of it. It's a hard.
I'm sorry, I realize that, but this is the difference between Socrates and Plato, because Socrates wanted to speak to others, not just to be speaking to himself. And again, that brings in looking at someone who totally disagrees with you and how to deal with that. And I think, for instance, one of the things that I was just thinking is this recent CNN problem. That is, people who want to argue, they like to argue with people who think like themselves. When they see the actual danger that's facing them, they don't particularly like that. And that's what happened in Germany and in Europe during World War II. The second point really, again, is another Kahneman thing, is loss aversion. There's a difference between losing a professorship and losing your life.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say, really.
Well, that's an important distinction, and we should never forget it. I mean, we should also remember that losing a professorship or losing your business can be profoundly dehumanizing, right? If you've spent a whole life working towards being a professor, and that's your identity, and you lose it, it could be dehumanizing. If you built a grocery store from first selling apples on the street and then finally doing this and taking out a loan and buying a grocery store, and someone comes and burns it down, and you say, well, I didn't kill anyone, I just burned your property. We have to remember that this can also be quite dehumanizing. But yes, you're absolutely right. On the question that you started with, and that I think is an really important question. How do you think from the perspective of others, right? So Arendt says you have to think, you have to let your mind go wandering, and you have to train yourself to constantly question yourself and think, how would people who disagree with me do this? I think I think this has become a political question today, right? It's around the question of what we call, decolonizing the curriculum or deplatforming, right? To what extent, when people say, don't bring speakers we disagree with to speak because they hurt people as feelings and whatever. Okay, that's one argument. But another argument you hear is, well, you don't need to bring them to speak. You can read them. And, one question that raises is, well, when you read someone you dislike, it's very easy to say they're wrong. But when they speak to you and then you tell them they're wrong and they say, no, here's why I think you're wrong, and they go back, it forces you to take them seriously and question yourself more than just reading them, unless you have become skilled, habituated in reading critically, not only what you're reading, but of yourself. And that's the hard part. And so I think you're right. Socrates learns to think maybe in the marketplace by questioning people, but he gets good enough at it that he can think on his own and let his mind go wandering. Part of our problem today is that we've lost that skill. We've lost that habit of really putting our own opinions, our own doxa, under the critical lens and taking seriously the fact, that many people disagree with us, and then saying, all right, how can I raise questions about my own self-certainty, bring those opinions in, question myself, and then figure out what I believe, right? That's the idea. I'll just say something about it because you raised it. I mean, I think, I heard Anderson Cooper's defense of CNN the other day. And, what he basically said is, you can't not let the guy who's probably going to be the Republican nominee for Congress speak in public. And he's absolutely right. You have to listen to Trump. But do you also have to listen to him in front of 300 or whatever adoring fans, right? That's the question, because when you do, it makes it very hard to have a thoughtful conversation, because every time you question him, you get a cheer or a boo or whatever. And so he then made the argument that you have to listen to these people, the Republicans, the Trump supporters. You have to actually listen to them, not just to Trump. This is, I think, an interesting point. Yes, you do have to listen to them. Do you listen to them, though, at a rally? Or do you listen to them one-on-one, talking and having a conversation? I think part of what CNN, in my opinion, got wrong, right, is that they think it's important to have a rally, a group, a mob voice present in the political discourse, rather than letting individuals present their viewpoints, be it the former president or some of his supporters, which I support. Now, you can make an argument, right, that mobs are part of our world and you should listen to mobs, right? But if that's the argument CNN's going to make, they should make that argument. And I don't think they're willing to make that argument. That's my own view on this. I don't know if that, so George, this comes from, my understanding of what you're trying to say is it's hard to train your mind to go wandering. You actually do have to listen to and confront other viewpoints, but you have to do so in a way that you can listen to them, question yourself, and make your own opinion. And that requires a certain calmness, kinds of space for thinking, not a space for yelling and screaming. That's all I wanted to say along those lines. And I'm sorry for my editorializing.
No, I agree with you. I just think you would like a better world than we have.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's absolutely imperative that we give Donald Trump and his supporters, and by the way, people on the far left who I don't often agree with, an important public platform to make their points. I just think you have to do it in a way that allows people to listen, engage, be self-critical, but also make their own judgments and not be swayed by mob-like behavior on both sides. Like there's plenty of rallies on the left, that I've made a huge thing. These people, this or the snapping and stuff. I think that's terrible because I think it's all designed to stop people from thinking for themselves and to create a kind of groupthink. And so I think we need to rediscover public spaces of thought and engagement with people we really disagree with, because those people are part of our world and we have to live with them on the left and the right. Vigdis.
Yes, I pretty much agree with that. What I was thinking of was a relation between Arendt and Kant, and when he has, first of all, his moral philosophy is about what we ought to do, and then he questions, are a human really have the possibility to be moral beings? And then he comes up with this human beings as part of both the intelligible and the sensible realm, as he says sometime. And then because we have a part in this intelligible realm, as he talks, that is why we can give ourselves the moral law.
Yeah.
And that is also why all inclinations are bad. My thought about Arendt, I think to me it seems like when she goes to Socrates so much in her thinking about morality, it has to do that kind of thinking that Kant does there is very much related to Plato and the late Plato and his thinking of kind of reaching this kind of insight that he in the law says comes from the philosopher, and the philosopher is the only one who sits with these true moral truth. But to me, it seems like Arendt is constantly struggling with how could we be moral? And the best she comes up with, and I think she might be pretty right in that, is thinking. And it is to think from different perspectives. And as you say, we have to listen to different people. But today, I think that one of the problems is that we are totally occupied by impressions from outside. So there's no room that people have for thinking any longer. And when they even have their smartphones with them to bed, there is absolutely, thinking means that you have to be in solitude to make yourself time to think. And you have this kind, as you say, dialogue with other people to listen to them to get their point, and not to have all this, as you say, in the rallies and so on, that's completely, there's no dialogue going. So, but I think it seems to me that Arendt constantly struggles with this, and especially then what make human beings think. And especially since you find these people all over, you find them among non-educated and in all walks of life. So there is this question, what is it really that makes some people think, and why do they say no, as some people did under the Nazi regime? So that is my take on these things, and especially with Arendt's relation with Kant versus Socrates. I don't know how you see that.
Thank you. I mean, I already, I mean, in my answer to Jerry earlier, I sort of talked a fair bit about my understanding of Arendt's reading of Kant, and I think it's fairly consonant with yours. I think on the one hand, Arendt and Kant both believe that you can't that morality is powerless to set an affirmative claim of what is moral. They both, though, believe that that everyone has a sense that they should be act morally. For Kant, he thinks he can philosophically prove that as following from the premise of man's being a rational being, right? That's ich bin ein vernünftiger Lebewesen. I'm a rational living being. And he says, nun sage ich, right? Now I say, if I'm a rational being, a vernünftiger Lebewesen, then I have these two sides of me, my rational side and my living side, my sensible side. But if I'm rational, I have to set my living side, my sensible side, under my rational side. And he thinks he can sort of prove that, and that once he proves it, it is in some sense dispositive. Although he then says maybe not, then the only way to prove it is to actually witness examples of people acting with obligation and being so in awe of those of people putting themselves under the moral law that I put myself under the moral law as well. And that's the aesthetic argument that Kant makes in actually the third critique, mixed with the second critique. And I think that's in the end where Arendt ends up as well. Although I don't think, and this is what my answer to Jerry was, I don't think in the end that she thinks there is a philosophical ground for obligation, as Kant wants to argue. I think she thinks it's something that we all have, but we have to come to it through the experience and act of thinking with ourselves. And that's her foundationalism, her anti-metaphysics. And so that's where, that's how I see her in relation to Kant, and very much on the side of Socrates in that regard. There was another part of what you said that I was going to respond to, but I've just slipped my mind, and I apologize. I don't know if, do you want, what else? What was the second part of what you said, Vigdis, that I'm just forgetting?
It is this slip in your mind. I'm not quite sure what it. I was about the doubt of Arendt constantly, and this kind of what makes you think. What makes you think? Yeah, because that I think is quite difficult to find, and when you see those who say no, I can't do that, they come from all kind of uneducated. You find them among criminals as well, actually, I would say. This has nothing to do with following the law or not following the law, obviously, as Arendt says with the Nazi and who followed the Nazi regime and applied that they follow the law, which is so many people do today. When, of course, you have these kind of, some say, oh, you acted immorally. And the answer they get, oh, I didn't break the law. So obviously, I think it's, you very often, at least I think that you hear people, they're just following laws and they think there's no thinking about the morality outside the law. So
No, it's a great question. What makes us think? And I, you know, my first attempt to offer something which may be inadequate here is that, I mean, just as for Kant, the moral law is taught not through rules, but through examples. Arendt as well, right, talks about in the book on judgment, or the lectures on judgment, that it is examples that, in a sense, train us to judge. And I would stretch that and say that what makes us think are seeing other people think. You know, what makes us think are seeing other people have an opinion and put that opinion out there, not to defend it at all costs and destroy everyone who contests it, but to test it and to ask, what do you think? And, you know, it's something we see so rarely today. Someone who changes their mind in public, someone who gets up on a debate stage, says something, and then hears something else and says, you know what? You're right. I'm gonna, if not, maybe I'm not gonna agree 100% with you, but I'm gonna take back part of what I said. That experience of seeing somebody think, that is, talk with themselves, engage other perspectives, let their mind go wandering, and question their own thought through the publicity of thought. That is amazing to see. And it can inspire you to think. And so just like for Kant, we only really put ourselves under the moral law when we see examples of people who exert obligation. I think for Arendt, we are given to think because when we see people thinking, we're just struck by how human it is, how profoundly human it is to think critically, to put yourself under question. And I think that's how we think, or why. And I think very few of us have that experience anymore of witnessing thinking in public. To me, that's what liberal arts education is about, right? It's not about, I have nothing that I actually want to impart to my students. All I want to do for them is teach them this example, this practice of thinking. How do you do that? It's a very difficult thing. I'm not, but that's what, to me, we should be doing. And all this stuff about, there's things you have to, there's learning outcomes and things you have to learn and this and that, that to me is the death of teaching. But obviously I'm in a minority there. But yeah, that's what gives us to think, is seeing other people think and be struck by how human it is and how extraordinary it is.
Don't you think it helps if you when you meet people to kind of ask questions, and often to ask about their view on things and make them think? I've kind of been struck by hearing some journalists that talks to people on the street. For instance, young people were asked that, don't you think when we have this problem with the climate and environment, that you could do something for it? For instance, could you buy less clothes and so on? They stop up and think, and yeah, I guess so. It's obviously they haven't even thought about it. So this kind of start to ask questions, do something, put in something against the mainstream thinking that's going on out there. Isn't that a bit like what you're talking about, to teach the humanities, to learn your students to ask questions about things? That's my
I mean, I think you have to teach them to ask questions, but you also have to teach them to listen, and then to make their own judgments, which means, I think it doesn't mean giving up your judgment. It means listening and revising your judgment and making your own judgments. But yes, that's exactly what I think it means. Ken.
I just have kind of an unformed and maybe brief question, which is, where does shared reality come into this conversation? Because when you talk about bringing in, Republican speakers, and I start thinking about the Republican Party, a lot of this seems to apply not so much even to Trump so much as to his supporters, who do seem like, a lot of their facts are based on are now gone Tucker Carlson or Fox News, and there is no conversation there that, you're talking about this public conversation, changing minds and thinking. And I understand for Arendt, it happens between people, but it happens between people that have a shared reality, right? We're sitting around a table and talking about a shared reality from different perspectives. But if there's not a shared reality there, I'll puzzle that out.
I'll stop you right there, because I think there is a shared reality. I mean, I think it's just way too easy to say that, we don't have a shared reality with Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson or any of that. There's plenty that I share with Donald Trump. Right? I mean, he and I can walk on the same street, not jump off the same bridge, speak the same language. We can share a lot. There's a lot we don't share, but there's a lot we share.
Well,
and
I'm talking specifically like what.
Just let me finish. Okay.
Yep.
To develop a shared reality means talking to people and not persuading them, right? Not telling them that I'm right, or not having them tell me that they're right, but talking with them and finding where we can agree. And there's probably much more we can agree on than that we disagree on. I know that may seem strange, but I think it's true. And so the question then is, can we agree to create a shared world that leaves certain things open, but builds on what we share? And, this is just my guess. I believe it, but it's my guess, is that if we actually sat down and had conversations in thoughtful ways, maybe like a citizen assembly with Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson and folks like that, and bring in, AOC and other people on the left, my guess is we'd actually find that there's a lot we agree on and could share, a lot more than we're finding out right now. But we don't have those spaces to have those conversations right now. And so I think from an Arendt's point of view, the way you build a shared world is by finding institutional spaces where you can talk about it, where you actually listen to each other and find where you can build on certain shared things and put the things you don't share in abeyance for a little while. And I think that's the kind of politics that I think she offers. I mean, when she says in some of her later essays and talks in the 1960s that she actually does believe that we can rebuild a common world through talking to each other, that's what I think she has in mind. She says, by talking about justice and piety, we can make the world more just and more pious. The more you sit down with people, you find things you agree with. You can't maybe solve all the problems, and there's going to be things you care a lot about that you're not going to get, and there's going to be things they care a lot about they're not going to get. But it's building step by step. That's what I take her to be offering.
And I agree with you for the most part. I was thinking very specifically, and I brought up Tucker Carlson because I was thinking about, what's that conversation look like about January 6th?
Well, I mean, look, I think there's probably what does it look like about January 6th? to some degree, let me just not, I think it's a complicated question. I think clearly, I think there's a deep desire that people like me have to have people who are not like me in this issue say, we admit it was wrong, right? We admit that it was wrong, and I think it's important. I do. I'm not going to give into that. That said, there is a kind of, desire to score political points here that is probably, offensive and problematic. And could you get beyond that? I don't think we should just give up on it, because I think it's important. You have to reaffirm a fundamental value in the legal and safe transfer of power in this country. I don't think that you can compromise on that. And so, I think, what you're saying is an important point. It may just be that there are certain people who, for whatever reasons, can no longer commit themselves to that. And if they can't, what do you do with them? Well, one answer is you deplatform them, right? And you say you can't come on CNN and you can't come on this. But if they're the leading candidate for the presidency from one of the two major parties, what do? Then I think you just have to let them speak, and you have to say, I disagree with you. And you have to say, not only do I disagree with you, I think what you're saying is wrong and dangerous. And you have to hope you can persuade the majority of the country that you're right and they're wrong. And I think that generally we have. I think most of the country believes they're wrong. But all I was saying about the CNN thing is that if you put them in a framework where you have a cheering section, it makes it much harder to have that kind of persuasive argument. All right, Bob, I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, tell me where I'm wrong. I think I'm thinking all of the time. Some of that thinking is technical, sequential, efficient, but I'm in a position to tell other people what to do and to impose fees, interest rates, whatever, on other people. And I'm always thinking morally in those instances. Well, most of the time, morally in those instances. I'm thinking, well, is this the right thing to do? Is there another way I can do it? Don't we all think much of the time? Isn't it rare for somebody who is not thinking much of the time? Or when we come to Eichmann, that's a special case. I mean, where he decided not to think. Where am I wrong?
You're putting me in a very tough position, Bob, because I'm going to have to tell you you're not thinking. But no, I mean, Nietzsche, right, said much the same thing as Arendt. He said that we can't possibly, if I were to think about everything I did and said, I would never do or say anything, because I'd constantly be letting it, thinking it through and raising new objections and thinking it through. At some point, you have to stop thinking and act. And so, Arendt says in the text we just read a couple of weeks ago, Introduction into Politics, where she talks about the prejudice against politics, right? She says that the vast majority of what we do is based on prejudices, prejudgments. If we were to sit down and every time one of your employees, Bob, comes to you and says, I have this problem, and you were to say, all right, let's think about this, and you were to, ask, go out and consult Kant and Aristotle and your other management gurus and do this, your bank would never run, right? And so at some point, what she says is most of what we do is based on prejudgments. We can't constantly be rethinking everything we do. You meet a new person and you make judgments about them. Those are called prejudgments. We call them prejudices. They can be accurate or inaccurate. They're always going to be somewhat inaccurate, but we have to live that way. And so what she says is we can't make real judgments all the time. We would never be able to live. Same with thinking. It would just be impossible to always, because thinking has no end, right? That's the point. If you're thinking, you never stop questioning. And so it's not that I'm not trying to say you're being thoughtless or anything, but what she's saying is that if you're thinking, you're not acting, because thinking never has an end. It has to constantly undo itself. And to the extent you are acting, you have to bring thinking to an end. And that's not a bad thing. She doesn't think we should think all the time. She thinks it would be impossible, but she thinks that there are times when thinking becomes deeply important. And that's what I think it's the next section. I don't know if I think it's the next section. Yeah. That we read for next week, is all about, that. And so we'll have time, it's either the next section or the one after that, but, we'll have time to speak more about that. But yes, that's the answer, is that, no one can think all the time, and we shouldn't expect it, and we shouldn't criticize people for it. The problem is not that we don't think all the time. The problem is that we, in her mind, rarely engage in the kind of thinking that really puts our basic prejudices to the test. And that's what she thinks we need to do. That's why thinking is dangerous, because it risks, right? She says there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. Thinking risks the basic common sense, common world beliefs, because it puts our basic prejudices to the test. And that's what she thinks we need to do more of. But she knows it's dangerous. And in that essay, Introduction to Politics, she says, it's when we start thinking and prejudices start to crumble, that's when it gets really dangerous. Because then, while there's a small chance that people will start to think and develop a new common sense that is broader, it's more likely that people will revert to their fundamental prejudices and make them even more hardened and reified and less thoughtful. And that's the danger we have to be aware of and confront. All right. It's been a pleasure. I think, are we meeting next week? Let me just check. Next week is the 19th. I think we're not meeting next week, right? Is that right? Is Friday the 19th? Are we meeting?
Yes.
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 We are.
Yeah.
We are meeting next week. All right. So enjoy.
Also, one note, I put an additional resource in the chat, the talk by Linda Zerilli on the question of why we should talk to others and persuasion. So if you want to check that out, it was a really brilliant talk on precisely this question of talking to the January 6th crowd.
Thank you. Actually, I watched that. It was hard to hear, and the thing I wanted to do it again. Thanks.
Okay. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you next week. Thank you all very much.